Hiya guys, Freddy here. Welcome back to another Satanic Panic video. And this time we're going to have a look at this.
Well, thank you and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this edition of the 700 Club.
So, this is television preacher Pat Robertson and his 700 Club, which ran for decades. Now, this particular long clip is from 1989, but he continued saying stuff against Dungeons & Dragons way up to 2013. So let's have a quick look at what he said in 2013.
Dear Pat, I want to ask for your opinion. Is it safe for a Christian to enjoy video games that have magic in them if the person playing the games is not practicing the magic?
I think, you know, the idea is not how close can I get to danger,
really?
but how far away can I stay from it. I don't know what game you're talking about. I know there's one called Dungeons and Dragons that literally destroyed people's lives. I mean, they got into this thing and they were almost, it was like demonic. I don't know what game you're talking about, but if it's based on magic and the occult and that sort of thing, stay away from it. There are other games you can play.
So obviously the person getting in touch was getting in touch about a video game. But Pat didn't know anything about video games. What he did know, though, one thing, was Dungeons & Dragons is dangerous, it's demonic, and you should stay away from it. And he was going to cover that no matter what, no matter how unapplicable that knowledge was. But anyway, let's go back to 1989.
Daily, nearly moment by moment, young people are bombarded by distorted visual images and twisted music messages that are saturating their minds and, yes, sabotaging their futures. Just ahead, a special presentation for youth, Satan's Targets.
Now, the focus of most of this section on the 700 Club is actually about rock and roll music and cartoons, which isn't really the focus of this channel, so I'm going to skip through a lot of it.
Some are calling it a war on the children.
Young people's imaginations have become the battlefield.
And it's Winky Pratney, everybody, who's been in a few videos before. Now, he is talking about Dungeons & Dragons, although in this section they've intercut it with scenes of rock and roll music, which makes you think he's talking about that.
Satan's not stupid. He understands that kids today are visual, and so he's making a play for excitement, for total involvement of the senses.
Which doesn't seem to be an argument against Dungeons & Dragons, rock and roll music or anything. It just seems to be an argument that Christian media should be just a bit more interesting. Now, I've skipped through a long section where they talk about the music of Madonna, how MTV videos, how a particular, just one episode of the Friday the 13th TV series was particularly bad, and the movie Ghostbusters 2. They're all full of demonic images and messages, so should be ignored. But anyway, they come on to Dungeons & Dragons.
Dungeons & Dragons. Some claim it's a simple, harmless game. Yet suicides, murders, and robberies have been linked to this game. Pat Pulling explains what happened to her son, a victim of Dungeons & Dragons.
And it's Bothered About Dungeons & Dragons and Patricia Pulling making a return. Now, this is 1989. She founded Bothered About Dungeons & Dragons in 1982. So by this point, she's been doing this for 7 years. Let's see if she's got any different messages to the exact same ones she's been telling us in all the previous videos.
He died because he became too involved with the game Dungeons & Dragons. His personality became one with the character that he was living at the time in the game, and he took his life because of the scenario he was playing at the time he died.
Now, once again, we see a slightly different variant on the story that she tells about the death of her son. This time she says it's because of the scenario that he was playing, but in previous times she says it's because of a curse the Dungeon Master put on him, or put on his character at least. And she said previously that there was no signs, whereas now she's saying that it's because of a long-term playing of the game, which changed his personality. Now, in a previous video I commented that there should have been signs as well, because he killed the family's cats. I'm actually slightly wrong there. He only killed one cat, and he killed about 19 rabbits the family had, and he skinned the cat in the garden. So there should have been some signs, at least before his suicide, that there was something going on seriously wrong with Bink Pulling.
Dungeons & Dragons emphasizes black and white witchcraft. It creates a world of fear and death.
No, it doesn't. In the core games, there's never been black and white witches in any version over the 50 years since Dungeons & Dragons came out. That's just a lie.
Dr. Gary North says, Dungeons & Dragons is the most effectively, most magnificently packaged, most profitably marketed, the most thoroughly researched introduction to the occult in man's recorded history.
And we get that wonderful quote from Dr. Gary North again, which TSR really should have used to advertise the game. Because Dr. Gary North is a financial expert. His doctorate is in that. He's not a mental health expert. He's not speaking from that side of things. He's not even a religious expert and speaking about it from a religious point of view. He's a financial expert and he's talking about how well marketed it is. They really should have used that to sell the game.
Children's books also hold occultic themes. How a weirdo and a ghost can change your entire life tells the story of children who dabble with a Ouija board and meet spirits.
And now they're away from Dungeons & Dragons and they're onto children's books. But I wanted to leave that section because that's a fantastically named book. I wish I'd read that as a kid.
Well, perhaps no example of what can come along to warp the minds of youth stands out stronger than that of what's known as the violent punk rocker movement that originated in England.
And keeping on the cutting edge of things, reminding you that this is 1989, he's speaking about punk rock. By 1989, the Sex Pistols and the rest of the punk rock scene was so far in history, we'd moved on to far newer things, and were far more likely to be listening to George Michael and being corrupted that way.
Today, all around you are sinister influences appealing to your imaginations and trying to capture your minds and hearts. You may not even be aware of them, but let's take a look at some startling examples.
Is it just me, or does he sound like he's talking about religion, insidiously trying to get inside your hearts and minds and control your lives?
Mike Palla had gotten hooked on Dungeons & Dragons, a controversial game of witchcraft where players take on the roles of both good and evil beings. The fascination lay in the use of his mind to invent the treasures and monsters that were a part of the game.
And it's the way they phrase it. It's a game of witchcraft where you can play good or evil, putting the emphasis that you could play evil characters. But that's ignoring the fact that if you play Monopoly and you're the banker and you're taking people's homes and hotels away, that's hardly good behaviour. That's pretty evil in itself. And perhaps the biggest thing that they criticise is it's a game that uses the mind, because that's the last thing anybody wants, is you actually thinking.
Unfortunately for Mike, the border between reality and fantasy was too easily crossed, and before he knew it, his mind had become a prisoner of his own imaginary world.
First of all, my school work started slipping. I wasn't doing my homework anymore.
Oh no, he wasn't doing his homework. I'm sure it's because of Dungeons & Dragons, and it wasn't because it's homework and not fun. I know I found a variety of reasons which weren't Dungeons & Dragons to not do my homework when I was at school. And I've had to get both of my kids to do homework at various times, which were nothing to do with Dungeons & Dragons, just because they didn't want to do work when they were home.
And I was spending so much time with my friends that I was neglecting my family and neglecting other areas of my personal life.
Oh no, he was spending time with friends instead of spending time with family. Which is kind of what you're supposed to do with a kid, because you're eventually going to leave your family and go out into the world. So you're learning how to interact with other people. It's kind of what being a kid's all about.
Soon, every spare moment was spent either playing the game, buying paraphernalia, or reading and studying the Dungeons & Dragons literature. The more deeply involved Mike became, the less satisfaction he found.
And of course it's just Dungeons & Dragons. Nobody else gets heavily into any other hobby, which distracts from everything else. Nobody gets compulsively into any other hobby, watching sports, anything like that. It's just Dungeons & Dragons.
Yet something compelled him to keep on, in spite of his growing despondency.
A sense of depression, a sense of just an overwhelming blackness and emptiness swept across me, and I... From that, it started to seem as though that the more that I involved myself in the game, the more depressed I started to feel.
But isn't that like being a kid? That sometimes you'll get into a hobby, spend all your time, and then you'll just move on. It'll start to bore you. You'll start to feel depressed about it because you're not playing it as well as you wanted to. It just isn't as fulfilling. So you move on. It's part of being a kid, learning who you're going to be by trying out different things.
The dark shadows of the day soon crept into Mike's dreams as wild, grisly nightmares haunted his sleep.
I would see just horrific, awful, just bloody and horrible creatures hacking at my friends, and I would stand there and watch my friends as they would be just hacked apart, and they were just incredibly gory dreams. And I would wake up at night, oftentimes I'd be so upset that I would not be able to sleep for the rest of the evening.
And I can't really comment on this, because I've never experienced dreams like this about a hobby or a movie or something I've been into. I've experienced nightmares about jobs I've worked in, and that's been a heavy clue that I should move on, I should get out of that job. So perhaps this was just his mind telling him that this hobby really wasn't fulfilling.
But even those nightmares could not tear Mike away from his obsession with the game. His depression grew more and more intense until one day Mike heard a voice from hell.
To me, and I will point out I have no psychological training or anything like this sounds like he felt like he was trapped. That his only friends and only contacts were through the game, so he kept going with it to get what little satisfaction, even though mentally he'd moved on. But again, I have no training, this could just be a wild guess of mine.
It wasn't an audible voice, but I heard a voice speaking to my mind suggesting, why don't you just destroy yourself? Why don't you just do what goes on in those dreams? Just destroy yourself, kill yourself.
And now we get onto a bit where he really sounds like he needed help. This sounds like a psychological problem. If you're starting to hear voices telling you to kill yourself, there's something wrong with you. You need to get help straight away. Because this isn't natural. It's not a hobby forcing it on you. You are unwell, and there's treatments for that. You are worth saving, so seek out help.
And I seriously considered ways in which, in a sense, planning my suicide, planning ways that I would destroy myself. But at that time, I have a godly mother who saw what the game was doing to me, who saw the danger, saw the depression.
While I think professional help would have been better, I'm glad he sought out his mother to help him. That she was there to be a shoulder to cry on, to get out all of these bad thoughts and release it without harming himself. I'm really glad that his mother was there for him.
Well, I felt it was evil. I definitely felt it was evil. He was suicidal, and that is really what brought me to seek the help of the Lord, because there was no other way to turn. And I found out that God answers prayers, and that we can take his promises from the Bible and apply them to our children's lives. And that's when I really started praying for him.
Now, while I'm not a believer in the healing power of prayer, I do think that him and his mother concentrating on his problems, discussing it, and then finding a way of focusing it into prayer probably helped him a lot. But again, this is pop psychology because I have no training in this kind of thing.
His mother's prayers are what motivated Mike to attend a Christian fellowship group one day at school. What he found there was a love and acceptance that began to penetrate the darkness in his life. It was after a weekend retreat with the group that Mike finally surrendered to the love of God.
Now, I'm tempted to say it's because there were girls there. Most role-playing groups have very few girls in them. And him moving to a social group which had more females paying attention to what he said will have boosted his psyche and helped stabilize him a lot. But again, that's just my opinion.
I knelt down and I said, Lord, I'm tired of running. I'm tired of the depression and everything that's in my life right now. I just give my life to you. I just commit everything to you. And I could feel a sense of pride in my life just being broke, and I felt myself actually being humbled.
So he focused on a problem, concentrated on what was going wrong in his life, and made changes. Now, none of this seems like a criticism of Dungeons & Dragons. This could have happened with any hobby at all.
And at that moment, at that very instant, the thoughts of suicide left. The depression left instantly. And it wasn't very long after that I took all of my Dungeons & Dragons stuff and threw it out and burned some of it.
And we come back to burning books, as we so often do in these videos. I don't know why Christians are so set on burning books. Give them away to charity shops, throw them in the bin, whatever you want. But burning books has a very bad symbolism. It doesn't have a good look for you. So don't do it. It makes you look like a certain other group which burnt a lot of books.
Mike's darkened spirit came alive. No longer lost in his world of fantasy, Mike has found a new passion, serving the one who turned his life around. As a student at Christ for the Nations Institute in Dallas, Mike is preparing for the ministry, and no one could be more pleased than his mother.
Christ means the most to Michael now. He wants to serve the Lord with all his heart. And I thank the Lord for that.
Now, I kind of wish I knew what happened to this guy, but alas, a Google search for his name connected with Dungeons & Dragons doesn't really bring anything up. So I hope that means he's had a quiet life, a happy life, that he's gone on to become a pastor or whatever the rank in his church is, and has preached to his flock and converted people to Christianity away from the evils of Dungeons & Dragons and led a fulfilling life.
Mike still has strong feelings about Dungeons & Dragons. He's careful to warn young people of the subtle danger of the game, telling them it leads down one of two roads, into the occult or suicide.
So I wonder which path he thinks I've taken. Well, I've definitely not taken the path of suicide, so I guess I've gone into the occult. Yay, I'm an occultist.
But he also never misses an opportunity to talk about the true source of fulfillment that he's found in Jesus Christ.
I love the Lord so much. He's done so much for me. He's lifted me out of the depression, and he's lifted me out of that. He's given me a reason to live. He's given me a message to share with people, a purpose for living. And he's given me a peace and a joy that just passes all understanding.
And that's something I don't really get, why so many Christians feel the need to be told their purpose in life. I've decided what I want to do for myself. I wanted to be a husband and father. I want to do my best at that, because that is fulfilling to me. I wanted to become a YouTuber because I enjoy it. I want all sorts of other things. I want to play Dungeons and Dragons because it's fun. Why do I need an external force telling me what the purpose of my life is?
A peace and a joy that passes all understanding. Some of you watching this program say, listen, this stuff, they're just games. Dungeons & Dragons, they're just games. These rock musicians, it's just a song, it's games. The cartoons, they're just sort of make-believe. Are they really things like demons? Well, the answer is you better believe it.
And so we're back with Pat. But it takes a kind of crazy turn here, because he's talking about demons being real. Well, show us one.
I want to tell you about a 17-year-old girl that I encountered a few years ago when a group of teenagers had joined my teenage daughter in holding what they called a coffee house in our garage.
They held a coffee house in your garage? Why didn't they hold it in the house? Do you not let your daughter use the kitchen?
And one night, about 9:20 in the summertime, they came to me and they said, listen, there's a girl in here who's demon-possessed. We want you to help us. Well, I thought they didn't know what they were talking about, so I was slightly delayed, but finally I came out. And here was this girl crouched down like an animal out in the country up against a fence.
Now, one of the things they claim against Dungeons & Dragons, against rock and roll music, against cartoons in this video, is that it's a source of indoctrination. But here we have the other side of it, where the daughter and the friends of a Christian preacher come to him because they say one of their friends is possessed by a demon. Now, this seems that they are completely indoctrinated to me.
And I said to her, what's the matter? She said, well, every time they pray, something inside of me says, get out of here.
And at this point, I have to empathize with the girl, because there's been situations I've been in where a bunch of people around me started praying, and a voice in my head said, get out of here.
And I said, is that what it is? And she said, yes, I just can't stand this voice inside of me that just wants to explode when these people pray. Well, I said, would you mind if I prayed for you? And she said, oh, no, don't do that, don't. And I then said, well, I'm going to pray for you. And
so he's with a 17-year-old girl, and he says he's going to do something. And she says, no, don't. But he says, I'm going to do it anyway. Now, whether this is about praying or anything else, it's a matter of consent, and she hasn't consented to this. This puts a darker spin on it than he could have ever imagined.
There were a couple of fellows standing around. I said, look, would you just please hold her hands, and I'm going to pray for her.
Now, I really am assuming there's nothing sexual to this, but the way he's talking about it, he got a couple of guys to hold her hands while he did something she didn't consent to. This sounds so bad.
And so I began to pray, and something happened to that girl. She was very small, slight of build, 17 years old, and she began to speak in another voice. And the voice said to me, you can't have her, she's mine.
And of course, you're going to bring out the two guys that were there who are going to witness that this actually happened. Or is this just something you're telling us?
And I thought, what am I dealing with? This is demonic. And I said, Satan, that's a lie. She belongs to Jesus. You come out of her. And then this same voice coming through this little girl said, you can't have her. We've won. We've won. And I said, that's a lie. Jesus has won. You have been beaten. And then she was struggling, and she screamed at the top of her voice, let me go. And there was this unearthly scream coming out of her. And I said, God, help me.
Now, this sounds like a fairly standard exorcism, so I'm going to skip much of the rest of it. But he really can't help himself with the language that she screamed no. An earthly scream came out of her at the top of her lungs, and he said, God help me. It sounds like a sexual assault while men are holding her down.
Is it real? They spoke to me. I know it's real. And they came out of her, and she was happy and at peace.
So he believes in demons. He says they're common events. He's performed exorcisms. So, you did this for decades. The show was on the air for absolutely years. Show us video footage of it happening. Make us believe it's real, instead of just you telling us a story.
And I want you to call us. I want you to share what God has done in your life. I want you to call in. If you need further prayer or help, it's 800-759-0700.
And that's where it ends. And I'm sure if you called up that number, they wouldn't ask you for money, that this just isn't a giant grift to earn this man many millions that he did during his life. So, there's not a lot in there. There's a story about somebody who was sad, who gave up their hobby and was a lot happier for it. There's Patricia Pulling coming back with her old stories about her son, although she seems to have changed them over the years. And we've got a man talking about demons without any proof. All of these Satanic Panic videos basically come down to the same thing, that they don't offer any evidence that Dungeons & Dragons is actually a bad thing. They just offer vague warnings. But anyway, I think I've whittled on for quite long enough as usual. So thank you very much for watching. But as always, most of all, you look after yourselves. And I'll catch you later. Bye now.